Hello, Sharkberts. This is Micah. I have decided to try and give you a visual representation of React with the Express app. So basically our MERN stack. And I've thought about this a little bit, but I'm kind of going on the fly here, especially with drawing on my screen. So please forgive me as I fumble through this. But the objective is to kind of demonstrate visually what React is doing. So we'll focus on that first, and then we will kind of pull back and take a bigger look at React with Express and how that's working. So initially when I'm drawing here, I'm going to be using my browser that you're seeing on the screen as a browser. But then later on when we implement or when we bring in the Express side of things, we're going to just treat this as a whiteboard. All right, so for right now, if we draw our components on the screen, let's say that, the highest level one, of course, is always going to be our app.js component. So let's just label that as app here in the upper right. And then I'm going to use our GameLib app as an example here. Of course, it is not as complex as some of yours are going to be, but again, we're going for the big idea here. And if you remember in our GameLib app, let me pull up our code real quickly, specifically the, yeah, that's right. We're just going to be, it's going to be drawing all over my code, but that's all right. In app, we render header and we render routes, right? So here's our header. And then the rest of all of this space is going to be what is returned from our routes component, right? So is it going to be the home page? Is it going to be the user list page? What page is it actually going to be? What is going to be returned from our router.js component? Well, according to our router.js component, it's going to depend on what's up in the URL. Is it a slash? Is it a slash register, slash login, games new, games ID, games, all that kind of stuff, right? So one of the pieces of confusion that I've noticed, and it makes sense, is that there's a confusion between the React routes and then those routes that we use to communicate with Express. The React routes, they have one job, which is basically, again, if you're looking at this code here, it is to conditionally, it is to conditionally render components. So again, we treat this like a switch case, right? So that it's kind of like a big if statement here. So if the URL path is slash, then render the home component. If it is slash register, then render the register component. If it's slash login, login component. If it is slash games, game list, and so on, right? Just a big if statement saying, if the URL is this, then render this component. So that if you look up in my URL bar, if we say, just slash up here, right? Then what that means is that router is going to return the home component inside it. That is what router is going to render or return, right? And our home component was a very, very simple component, right? It just had welcome to GameLib biz, and that was it. That was the only thing. It wasn't going any deeper. It wasn't even making a call. It didn't even have any logic to make a call to the back end. It was just a welcome message, and that was it. So that is if we go to just slash, right? So let's say that we're logged in and we want to go to our games page. So our URL up top is going to be /games instead. And what we're going to do is router is going to render the game list. So we'll say game list is now going to take up this big portion of our browser page. But game list isn't done there, right? It's not just a simple component like our home component is. Game list is going to render games. So then we take a look at games. And games is going to render game card for each one of those. So what does that look like? Well, that means that game list has a single child, which is our games component. And this is where the nesting piece comes in, right? Because if you remember, like when we introduced React, we were talking about how each component is basically just responsible for a piece of the DOM, just a piece of the DOM. So that inside games, if we have multiple games in here, well then let's say that we have 3 games, right? So we have game card here. We have another game card. And we have our third game, because we've only created 3 games. All right, so that's a lot going on for when we just go to /games, right? Going to /games, again, the header is there no matter what, right? It's not affected at all by the URL. The header is just always there, which makes sense. That's what a header should be doing. What is going to change is what is again returned from the router. In this case, what is returned is our game list, which renders games, which renders as many game cards as we have games. However, the complexity comes in here because now we have decided that somewhere inside our nested components here, we're actually going to make a call to the backend. Again, this has nothing to do with what's going up in our going on in our URL up here. This is only a conditional, like rendering, hey, which component, which high-level component do we want to render? Do we want to render home, register, game list? What do we want to render? That's going to be determined by this URL up here. And you'll notice that is why we put these high-level pieces in our pages folder. All of those components inside, all of those files inside the pages folder are still components. They're just components that are representing a page, and then inside them, we're going to render various components, and that's why anything that is deeper than the highest level here is going to be in our components folder. So again, if it's the highest level, it's representing the entire page, which is why we put it in the pages folder. If it's anything that is nested underneath that, we put it in the components folder. All right, so that is what our React routes are doing. That is what let me see if I can do this cleanly here. Oh, I did not mean to clear the entire thing. Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to see if I can just delete the pieces so that we can do one more example, which is going to be, let's say that we go to, I think it was /games/new, right? Up at the top. So if our URL is /games/new, then now what we're doing is just rendering, and I think the component was called newgame.js. And that just puts that form on the page, right? So new game. And you can do this with all of the components that you have in your own app or in the GameLab app or whatever app you want. You can draw this up every single time. But what we're going to do now is we're going to stop treating my browser as a browser and just treat it as a whiteboard. So I'm going to go ahead and clear things out. And we're going to just basically, we're kind of taking a step back here so we can see both the browser and our Express server at this point. So in our browser, let's say that we are looking at the new game, right? So we have our header in there. We have, let's say that we have gone to games/new. And inside here, of course, we have our header. And then we have our new game component that has the form that lets us fill out the title, the publisher, and I don't remember the other pieces of a game that we have, but basically the form that we fill out to create a new game. Now, if you think back to our first, or project one, our first full stack app, the one that used EJS and Mongo and Node and Express, all of our communication between the client, i.e. the browser, and our server, which is our Express server, was done by the submission of a form, by the click of a link, or by the submission of a URL up in the URL bar, right? So if we fill out, if we filled out the URL bar and submitted it, or if we clicked on a link, those are GET requests. Every single time those are GET requests, right? We can't override that, at least not without JavaScript or jQuery, which is kind of a hint to where I'm going with this. And then we use the form to create a post request, and then we had to trick it, using that underscore method, using the method override to make it so that we could use it for put requests as well as delete requests. And they were post requests from the client, but then when they hit the Express server, Express interpreted them as put or delete requests, thanks to that method override. Well, in React, our request to the back end, or communication with the back end, is not technically on the submission of a form or the click of a button or the click of a div or a paragraph or anything like that. It is fetch requests. And because of that, what we did was we set up a special controller on the React side, and we called it game model. Inside game model, we set up, I think we had, what was it, five different methods in here. All of our static methods all show create, edit. Oh, we don't have delete in here. So we've got 4 in here. And what these are doing, this is going to be our point of communication between the backend. There's actually nothing over here in our regular React stuff, in our app.js, in our routes, in our header. None of that is communicating with the backend. All of that is just responsible for rendering UI. But some of those components, we will say inside that component, for example, user list or new game, inside this component, we're going to, oh, whoops, I forgot that we redid this. So I'm going to just switch branches here for a second. Let's see, where were we? Sharper client, okay. Oh, that's funny. All right, looks like I'm not going to be able to do what I was hoping to do, but let's imagine that we imported the game model up here, right? And thanks to recoil and hooks, we set it up slightly differently, but it's the same idea. Let's say that we imported game model in here, and then we're using game model to actually do the interaction with the back end. All right, so let's say that we are at game/new and that we have the new game component on the page. Well, we fill out all the fields of that form, right? We fill out the title, we fill out the publisher, and then as soon as we submit it, that's where we are saying use the game model, specifically the new method, and that new method is going to send a post request to our backend. This is supposed to say API v1/games. And you'll notice we decided to make this URL different from this URL, and that was on purpose because, again, this is just conditionally rendering a component or components. This is responsible for being kind of the meeting place between the front end and the back end. We have decided to say that all right, the front end and the back end are going to agree that this is where we meet to exchange data. And we call it API because our Express server is going to be set up as an API. That is, it's only going to serve up data or consume data. It's not going to render any sort of views, any sort of UI on the server side. And then we said v1 just because, yes, it's the first version of this API, which, you know, in future iterations, maybe we develop a v2 API that goes to /games as well. And then /games just tells us, hey, this is all about the games that we are storing in our database, whether we want to create something, update something, read something, or delete something. So our new method in here is going to take this URL. It's going to set it up as a post request. It's going to JSON stringify a body of data. And then it's going to send that request to the server that's listening for it. And this time, actually, I'm going to undo that. This time, what we're going to do is, I'm going to set this up vertically so that our Express server, let's say that this is our server.js. This is our routes. This is our controllers. These are our models, or specifically the game model, so singular. And then let's just set up our database over here that's just sitting there waiting for queries, right? All right. So as so our request is going to come from game model, and it's going to go to our server. Our server is going to feed the request to our routes. The routes are going to direct our request to the controllers. And then our controllers are going to use our model to communicate and send that query to the database. The database, of course, is going to return. So let's say that in this case, what we're doing is creating a new game, right? We've filled out our form, and then on submit, inside that handle submit method, inside our new form.js component, let me say that again. When we submit this form inside new form.js, or new game.js, sorry, when we submit that, we said on submit equals this dot handle submit, right? And then inside handle submit, we are going to make a request to the game model, whether it's through hooks, whether it's through a class-based component. Somehow this the submission is going to make it to the game model. And then once it is in the game model, it's going to make a further relay. And this time, now we're actually communicating with the backend, and we have, sent some data. We come through here, and our express.json middleware is going to make sure that data is available in rec.body. The request is going to go through the routes, which then get routed to a controller. Inside here, our controller, of course, I believe it was just called create or create game or something like that, right? And create game is going to take the game model, and it's going to pass the rec.body to our database. And then our database will, of course, just reply with our new game. And then our controller is going to, we'll pass that new game back up to the controller. And I genuinely don't know the answer to this, whether the controller is going to directly reply back to React, or if it's going all the way through the server. I'm just going to say that the controller is going to respond back to game model. Game model is then going to, in fact, I say then on purpose because it's going to then the response, get the JSON from that response, the response from the controllers, and then it's going to pass that response back to our regular app, the components, the structure of our app. So that's kind of the flow between, oh, hold on, I should have, I guess just to be consistent, say that our response is blue. So that is our response back to the React side of things. That is the visual flow between what's going on in React and the difference between the front end routes and then the routes that it's actually using to communicate with the Express server. When that request comes in using that route, the request is going to go through the usual files, server, routes, controllers. Controller is going to use the model, get the data from the database, pass that data back. So let's do one more example. Pass the data back, and then the data is going to go all the way back to our React side, where that fetch request is going to finish handling the response. It made the request in the fetch piece, and then it handled the response in the .then piece. All right, so let's do one more example, which is going to be, let me just erase a few things. We'll get rid of that. And we're going to get rid of, so let's just do /games, right? Because that's going to be our game list, which had the games inside it, which had multiple game cards inside it. I'm just going to draw two here. All right, remember, every single component is responsible for a piece of the DOM, right? Or rendering child components that are responsible for pieces of the DOM. All right, now in this scenario, our user list was, sorry, not user list, our game list component was where we communicated with our game model. And now we're saying we want all of the games. So now we're going to send a GET request to this URL. That GET request is going to go through the server, going to go through the routes, and in the controllers, now it's going to hit our index controller instead of our create controller, right? But it's still going to use the game model to get all of the data, all of the game data from the database, which is going to then respond back to our fetch request, and then the .then is going to handle that response, get the JSON, hand it back to our user list, which is going to pass it as props to our games, which is then going to use each game inside that games array to render an individual game card. All right, so hopefully that helps visually, maybe a little bit, get closer to understanding which pieces are which in the React side of things. Like, when is the actual communication with the backend happening? It's not. It's only happening in our model, in our front end models. That's the only place that it's happening. There is nowhere else in our React app where a communication with the backend is happening. It's all going through the model every single time. And we did that on purpose so that we weren't doing just random fetch requests throughout all of these different components, therefore making it a little bit hard to track. Instead, wherever we need to communicate with the database, we import our model into the appropriate component, or we import the appropriate hook, which communicates with the model. And then the same exact concept, the same exact flow is happening, whether you're using hooks or just or using the class-based components, either way. All right, again, hopefully that helps a little bit, again, with the visualization. Remember that if you have multiple models in your app, it'll just basically be, depending on what is communicating. Like we did end up having, of course, the auth model, but it's all the exact same idea. It's just a different URL, right? Which then hits the server and hits a different route and hits a different controller, uses a different model, but it's all the same idea at the highest level. I guess in our game app, we did our game library app, we did have 3 different models, but again, all of them are responsible for communicating with the database, depending on if they are imported and so on. So there you go. All right, well, I will see you all tomorrow, but again, hopefully this helped a little bit with the visualization. Feel free to, of course, diagram your own apps if that helps you to understand the flow of what's happening with different front-end routes, and then different API routes.